Deep in the ocean between Australia and East Timor is a treasure chest of natural resources. But this lucrative oil and gas field has brought more than just wealth. It's also created diplomatic intrigue and allegations of espionage, which are now being challenged in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Anika Simonis reports on the saga of the Timor Gap Treaty.
Australia is in hot water with the international courts over a spying allegation made by East Timor. Unfolding at The Hague, East Timor has accused Australian secret operatives of bugging their president Shoshana Gusmao's office during the 2004 negotiations over the lucrative oil and gas reserves in the Timor Sea. Australia has bitten back, saying they acted in the interest of national security. Yet East Timor believes Australia infringed the country's privacy, lifting billions of dollars from the small island nation amidst the crucial negotiation. East Timor has often played the victim to its larger neighbours. In 1975, the country was invaded and brutalised by Indonesia. During its occupation almost 15 years later, Indonesia signed an illegal agreement with Australia. Spokesperson for the Timor Sea Justice Campaign, Tom Clark, said Australia gained generously from the agreement.
In 1989, an agreement was reached between Australia and Indonesia to split the resources in that area 50-50 between the two countries. But obviously this was a fairly morally bankrupt move on Australia's behalf because neither Indonesia or Australia had claim over those resources. So really it was often perceived as Australia, I guess, acknowledging or recognising Indonesia's sovereignty over East Timor when other countries around the world didn't recognise that, and in return Australia got a fairly generous amount of revenue, potential revenue coming from the oil fields in that area.
Little over a decade later, East Timor gained independence in 1999. Mr. Clark said that while East Timor celebrated their independence, they had a hard journey ahead.
I guess the devastation of the occupation in East Timor was profound and long-lasting. So when Timor became independent, it was really starting from zero, or negative zero, below zero really, in terms of the amount of damage inflicted on basic infrastructure and the scorched earth policy, I guess, of Indonesia as they withdrew, really meant that the Timorese were building their nation from scratch.
Dissolving the treaty, Australia was forced to acknowledge the nation's sovereignty and rethink the agreement as Indonesian troops withdrew from the land. 3 years on, poverty-stricken and desperate for wealth, East Timor established a new agreement with Australia. The Timor Sea Treaty, signed in 2002, created new hope for war-torn East Timor. Yet their desperation for immediate wealth betrayed their push for long-term security, as East Timor was again denied a maritime boundary. But 2 years later, East Timor's first Prime Minister, Mari Alkatiri, made fresh attempts to negotiate the nation's boundary. Mr. Clark said Australia did this to cheat East Timor out of their entitled wealth.
Since East Timor's independence, we've also used some fairly hardball negotiating tactics to push Timor into a series of temporary resource sharing agreements. All of these agreements shortchange East Timor out of billions and billions of dollars that under international law they're actually legally entitled to.
Controversy spiked in 2002 when a $40 billion oil and gas field was discovered within the Timor Sea. The multi-billion-dollar field, the Greater Sunrise, reignited the same question of ownership. Denied once more, Mr. Clark said East Timor felt it was more than just their boundary that was left unacknowledged by Australia.
But also, on top of the issue of the money, is for a lot of Timorese, this issue is more about sovereignty. They say, look, we fought for 25 years to become our own country, and yet today when we look at a map, it's not clear where our country begins and starts. And that's because Australia's really just refused to establish a permanent maritime boundary with Timor.
Based on the Timor Sea Treaty, the Greater Sunrise was split between both countries, with 80% existing in Australian waters and 20% shared in the Joint Petroleum Development Area. East Timor, however, argued otherwise. The country believed that if Australia had acknowledged their maritime boundary, most, if not all, of the Greater Sunrise would belong to them. Again in 2006, after significant concessions were made by both Australia and East Timor, a new agreement was signed.
Australia's strategy in these negotiations has been not to, basically to refuse to establish a permanent boundary, and instead they've really pushed East Timor into a series of temporary agreements. And these are agreements that look at how to divvy up the revenue from particular fields while avoiding the broader issue of sovereignty and where a boundary should be.
Under this new treaty, both parties were able to terminate the deal if, by 2013, there were no agreements made about where the gas fields would be processed. But this resource ownership or maritime boundaries is not the issue underway at the International Court of Justice. In 2012, East Timor accused the Australian government of bugging their president's office during the treaty negotiations that followed the discovery of the Greater Sunrise. Deakin University's Pacific Politics professor Damien Kingsbury said Australia has long monitored East Timor.
Australia has an international intelligence activity, and it operates in many countries, and East Timor is certainly one of them. Australia has always spied on East Timor, going back to the 1970s. We've had signals intercepts going back to the 1970s. But since independence, or since 1999, Australia has had a very close monitoring of signals traffic, that is, telephones, radio communications, computers and so on.
Allegedly feeding information back to the country's Australian embassy, President Guzman argued secret agents spied on him and his negotiators for financial leverage ahead of the 2006 CMATS Treaty Agreement. Australia has denied the claims and has argued that the bugging was an order of national security. Yet East Timor has asked the court to dissolve the CMATS Treaty, as Australia did not act in good faith during the negotiation.
If the Timor Sea Treaty is found to be invalid and that Australia has been found to have conducted negotiations in bad faith by spying on the Timorese cabinet deliberations, then it means that potentially the treaty could be up for renegotiation. East Timor now has money in the bank. It can bargain and it can survive by itself for some time, so it doesn't need to continue with the existing arrangement. And under international law, I think East Timor is in a much stronger position than Australia to renegotiate the boundary in its favour and to receive a much greater proportion of not just the income from the existing oil and gas, but from future gas deposits, in particular the Greater Sunrise field.
A win for the East Timorese could mean more than just dissolving the unfair treaty. It may provide the nation with billions of compensatory dollars to save their nation. Or more importantly, it may allow the country to begin renegotiating a permanent maritime boundary that recognises their hard-fought sovereignty.
Anika Simonis reporting. Next, we'll focus on the environment of East Timor. That's in a moment.